Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to read about one of my favorite history topics, the Titanic. This is a really cool little magazine, and it came out, I want to say like a year and a half ago, the anniversary of the Titanic sinking, but it mainly has to do with how the Titanic was discovered, and I'll show you what I want to read to you tonight. If I can. There we go. We're just going to read this chapter, Setting Sail, the sailing and sinking of the Titanic. We're just going to read about the before and during the sinking of the Titanic. So, let's just dive right in. Really cool. Here we go. The sailing and sinking of the Titanic. It's an actual photograph of it. Setting sail. Here we go. The making and mythology of the Titanic. And I'm going to use pointer pencil to help us read tonight. Until an icy night 100 years ago, the word Titanic suggested good things. Godlike titans ruled a golden age of Greek mythology. Titanic meant big, powerful, extraordinary. That changed on April 14th and 15th, 1912, as the Royal Mail ship Titanic, the world's largest and most opulent ocean-going vessel, steamed westward on its maiden voyage. About 1,000 miles east of Boston, it struck an iceberg and disappeared in 2 hours 40 minutes. More than 1,500 passengers and crew died, including some of the grandest celebrities of the day. Unsinkable. A rescue ship, the Carpathia, plucked 706 survivors from lifeboats. Their stories of the tragedy seemed impossible. Sink, how could it? At 882.5 feet from prow to stern rail and 175 feet from keel to funnel tops, the Titanic stretched as long as 4 city blocks and as high as a 9-story building. 15 steel bulkheads divided its interior into compartments advertised as watertight. The Titanic's builders figured it could stay afloat at any possible accident. Sink. In the previous 40 years of North Atlantic travel, only 4 passengers had died. Disasters had become obsolete. Sink. Even the Titanic's captain once announced he could envision no scenario in which a modern ship might go down. Shipbuilder magazine had examined the Titanic and pronounced it virtually unsinkable. Over time, the adverb evaporated, and yet sink it did, in a perfect storm of human error and hubris. Like the Titans themselves, the word hubris is Greek, and it means extreme pride or arrogance. Never again after April 1912 would humanity feel so smug. Hubris inserted itself into the Titanic story at the ship's conception. That occurred over Napoleon brandy and Cuban cigars in the London home of Lord William James Peary on a summer night in 1907. Enjoying their drinks and smokes were J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, and Lord Peary, chairman of the shipbuilding company Harland and Wolff. Titanic competition. White Star had amassed a fortune ferrying emigrants to America as well as shuttling wealthy passengers across the Atlantic. But it had competition. Rivals sought to build faster, more comfortable ships. American and German lines fought for control against British counterparts, including Cunard. Let's go with Cunard. In 1906 and 1907, Cunard introduced the Lusitania and the Mauretania, 2 passenger ships that seemed the last word in speed and luxury. Ismay refused to be outdone. He wanted Harland and Wolff to build White Star, a fleet of ships that would dwarf the competition. So while relaxing after dinner, Lord Peary sketched the ships Ismay wanted. There would be 3, all alike. They would be 120 feet longer and 12,000 tons heavier than Cunard's biggest. They would have 3-story engines fired by 29 coal-burning boilers. Their lines would be elegant, their capacity astounding, their safety beyond question. First to be built would be the Olympic, followed by the Titanic, then the Gigantic, later renamed the Britannic. More than 15,000 workers, there's some of them, teamed through the Harland and Wolff gates in Belfast, Ireland, every morning to produce ships of iron and steel. They laid the Titanic's keel on March 31st, 1909, next to that of its twin, the Olympic. Over the next 2 years, about 3,000 workers devoted themselves to the Titanic. They riveted overlapping steel plates to shape the hull and prepared the shell for its decks. Thomas Andrews, Harland and Wolff's chief designer, supervised construction. He felt proud of his work. On a night in 1910, Andrews brought his pregnant wife to the shipyard to show off his other children, Olympic and Titanic. Halley's Comet blazed overhead. Launch day, May 31st, 1911, broke clear and bright. Lord Peary, Ismay, and American millionaire J.P. Morgan, who had acquired financial control of White Star, joined a crowd of about 100,000 to watch the Titanic slide into the river Lagan on greased wooden skids. Support poles fell away. Lord Peary gave a signal to release the final restraints, and the Titanic moved for the first time. Overhead, signal flags on the gantry spelled good luck. The Titanic floated, but only a skeleton and skin. The process of fitting out required nearly a year. It included framing and furnishing rooms, raising 4 funnels or smokestacks, and doing everything necessary to prepare for sailing. Not a shilling was spared. The ship boasted a heated swimming pool, Turkish bath, cafes with palm trees, a first-class dining saloon that could seat 554, a gymnasium, a squash court, and a room with a Marconi radio, which is a wireless telegraph, which was intended not only to send safety messages at sea, but also to please rich passengers who wanted to communicate with the shore. A first and final voyage. Workers rushed to finish applying final bits of paint and polish by March 31st, 1912. The day 62-year-old Edward John Smith, captain on all White Star maiden voyages, came aboard to oversee the Titanic's sea trials. Smith announced this would be his last Atlantic crossing, upon his return to England, he would happily retire. The Titanic passed its sea tests and received certification from the British Board of Trade. It sailed to Southampton to take on coal and passengers. Passengers converged on Southampton docks on the morning of April 10th. Crowds gawked at the giant, seemingly invulnerable ship. Passenger Sylvia Caldwell asked a deckhand, "Is the ship really non-sinkable?" He replied, "Yes, lady, God himself could not sink the ship." The Titanic set sail at noon just as 7 stokers, or the firemen who worked in the ship's boiler room, who had been drinking in a pub and lost track of time, ran for the ship but failed to get aboard. No doubt they felt disappointment. As the ship moved along Southampton's River Test, it passed the berthed liner New York. Suction from the Titanic yanked the New York from the dock and snapped its mooring lines. Just before the smaller ship could be pulled into the Titanic, Smith ordered a blast from his ship's port propeller, opening a space between the two. The Titanic narrowly avoided a collision. The Titanic then zipped to Cherbourg, France, and Queenstown, Ireland. More passengers got on, some got off, and the ship bid goodbye to Queenstown on April 11th. Debarking passenger Francis Brown snapped the last picture of the Titanic afloat. With its stern to the camera, the lines of its decks and funnels converged toward the vanishing point of America. A crowd jammed the poop deck, which is the deck that's the highest on the ship and closest to the stern, for a last look at the old world. The ship then headed west out of sight, and a third-class passenger played the sad Irish song Erin's Lament on bagpipes. All aboard. People aboard the Titanic worked, played and followed their dreams in ways a 21st century audience understands. But they lived in a more class-conscious world. Ocean travel required people from all walks of life to share physical space, yet each social class kept to itself except for relationships such as master and servant that followed carefully circumscribed rules. People from different classes just didn't mix or mingle in 1912. The poorest steerage passengers included those who truly knew destitution. Some hailed from parts of the world where farm families lived in stone huts with animals. Some sold everything of value they possessed to purchase their tickets and had little left over to start new lives in America. For them, warm rooms, modern plumbing, and abundant food must have seemed luxurious. In addition, the Titanic accommodated hundreds somewhere between the top and bottom layers, representing all walks of life: shopkeepers and musicians, machinists and students, and the ship's hard-working crew to whom the Titanic acted as a second home. First class. Then there were the first-class passengers. The Titanic teemed with the rich and famous in first class. Long before film actors and rock musicians topped celebrity lists, millionaires served as the glitterati. Some, such as the internationally known journalist W.T. Stead, enjoyed the attention. Some did not. Among the latter were Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon of Scotland. They travelled under the last name of Morgan, possibly to throw off suspicion of Lady Duff Gordon, whose dress business had run afoul of U.S. customs. Another first-class couple identified themselves as Mr. and Mrs. George Thorne. The fact is, there was no George Thorne, nor were a couple of Mr. and Mrs. George Rosenshine of New York City boarded the Titanic at Cherbourg with his mistress, Gertrude Maybelle Thorne, who went by her middle name. First of all, check out this bedroom. Gorgeous. To divert attention from their awkward status, Rosenshine became Thorne for the voyage. Also incognito were a group of men whose real names did not appear on the ship's passenger list: professional gamblers George Bradley, C. Romaine, and Harry Homer, who skinned unsuspecting passengers at the card tables on North Atlantic liners. If fellow passengers had recognized their names and true professions, the gamblers wouldn't have been able to get anyone to join them in a game, and thus would have lost their main source of income. There were also first-class passenger and perfume maker Adolf Saalfeld, whose leather case was plucked from the ocean floor in 2000 by RMS Titanic Inc., the company that salvaged the Titanic and placed restored artifacts on display. The case contained samples of perfume Saalfeld manufactured. When opened, one vial freed the scent of roses and violets and inspired a 21st century perfume expert to create a similar scent called Night Star. Among the other first-class passengers were John Jacob Astor IV. His great-grandfather had started the family fortune in furs and then parlayed it into one of the world's biggest money piles by buying property in New York. Astor had divorced his first wife and boarded the Titanic with his second, 18-year-old Madeline Force. Madeline was pregnant and survived, while John Jacob did not. Benjamin Guggenheim, a millionaire from his family's mining background, like Rosenshine, he traveled with a woman who was not his wife. And Margaret Brown, wife of a Denver mining millionaire. After 1912, people knew her by her nickname, the unsinkable Molly Brown. Second class. One step below the ranks of the upper crust, the second-class passengers enjoyed accommodations that would have passed for first class on most ships. Second class enjoyed the same food, albeit with fewer choices, and on slightly less elegant chinaware than first class, and had its own library, a favorite of children for its books and of adults for its relaxed atmosphere, conducive to reading, card games, and conversation. Second-class staterooms had comfy beds, sofas, and desks. The list of second-class passengers included the following individuals: Annie Funk, a Christian missionary from India. She found a place in a lifeboat but gave it up so a mother with 2 children could survive in her place. Secret lovers Kate Florence Phillips, age 19, and Henry Samuel Morley, 39. Morley left behind his wife and English sweet shop to run away with Kate to America. He gave his young mistress a sapphire necklace. While she survived the Titanic sinking, he did not. Third class. Third class rooms were clean and comfortable. For some of the poorer families, dinners of mutton, fish, and boiled potatoes eclipsed anything they had eaten. The third-class passengers boarded at E-deck. They hailed from not only Britain and America, but also Italy, Germany, the Middle East, and other founts of immigration. Single men, married couples, and families had berths in the forward section, while single women stayed aft. Married couples and families had their own rooms. Single men and women in groups of 3 to 5 shared common rooms. One amenity was decidedly lacking. Third class had only 2 bathtubs, both in the stern. It was not an oversight. Many low-income people viewed bathing as unhealthy, an attitude that only reinforced the upper class's desire for maintaining their strict physical separation. The Adrenal Parish passengers. 14 of Titanic's third-class passengers came from Adrenal Parish, a lovely corner of Ireland marked by pasture, heath, and bog. Most were young women, and all knew each other. Author Pauline Barrett, a relative of one of the 14, published their history in the Adrenal Titanic story in 2010. 11 of the 14 died when the ship sank, likely causing their parish to suffer greater loss proportionately than any other place. The Titanic crew. While passengers' lives have helped breathe life into historical accounts of the world of a century ago, those with the most knowledge of what went wrong on the night of April 14th and 15th, 1912, went down with the ship. The captain, along with his chief officer and first officer, was not among the 207 crew members who survived. Neither was chief designer Thomas Andrews of Harland and Wolff, who knew more about the Titanic than anyone. Captain Edward John E.J. Smith had led the Titanic crew of 892. They ranged from officers tasked with navigation, steering, and updating log and charts. Here's the captain. To a diverse organization that included seamen, stewards, waiters, engineers, boiler room stokers, barbers, doctors, cashiers, teenage bellboys, and elevator operators, not to mention a masseuse and a Turkish bath attendant. Ensuring that the ship met the builder's high standards, 9 Harland and Wolff employees, known as the Guarantees, sailed on the Titanic to fix any problems they saw. Harland and Wolff dispatched the so-called Guarantee Group on every maiden voyage. They included men skilled in plumbing, electrical systems, carpentry, and machine fitting. Thomas Andrews, who led the group, named the rest of the Titanic's guarantees at the last minute. William Campbell, Roderick Chisholm, Alfred Cunningham, Anthony Frost, Robert Knight, Francis Parks, William Henry Parr, and Ennis Watson. Andrews noted a few small things in the Titanic's brief time at sea, particularly problems with a hot press, which is a device for heating food, in the first-class galley, and the too dark pebbled dashing or faux stucco between the half-timbers of the private promenades. No doubt the Guarantee Group sprang into action after the Titanic started taking on water, but none of them survived to tell their tales. A century after the ship sank, Belfast playwright Martin Lynch authored a tribute to Andrews and his hand-picked crew, the Titanic Boys. Strangely, he said he'd never heard of them while growing up. Iceberg right ahead. On April 14th, the third day of the voyage, Captain Smith kept his normal Sunday routine by inspecting the ship, but declined to conduct the boat drill chat that normally followed. He led a worship service and then met with his officers to fix the ship's position. According to their calculations, the Titanic averaged a sprightly 22 knots. The setting sun lowered the temperature to freezing, and the sea surface shone like glass. A flat sea seemed safe, but it hid danger. Icebergs, common to the North Atlantic in spring, would be hard to spot without waves to break against their sides. Nevertheless, Smith kept the ship at full speed. He believed the crew would react in time to any bergs. The first warning. Icebergs indeed laid ahead. By 7:30 p.m., the Titanic had received 5 radio messages from nearby ships that warned of ice. Marconi wireless operator Jack Phillips took down a detailed ship's message pinpointing the location of heavy pack ice and a great number of bergs. But Phillips, busy sending passengers his personal messages, apparently did not show it to any officer. At 10:55 p.m., another ship, the Californian, radioed to say it had come to a full stop amid dense field ice. Neither message began with the crucial code that would have required Phillips to show it to the captain, and Phillips was not in the mood for interruptions. The Californian's electric signal was so close it nearly deafened Phillips. Shut up, he radioed back. I am busy. A while later, the Californian's radio operator shut down for the night. Minutes ticked by and the Titanic surged onward. High in the foremast, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee peered into the darkness. Just before 11:40, Fleet noticed something blacker than sea lying directly ahead. At first it seemed just a raw shape the size of 2 tables, but as the ship drew closer, recognition dawned. He rang a warning bell 3 times and phoned the bridge. "What did you see?" came the voice through the receiver. "Iceberg right ahead," replied Fleet. Failed attempts. I'm sorry, I was reading this caption. This is a photo of the iceberg, and there's a streak where the Titanic brushed against it. That's wild. Okay, sorry for the long pause. Failed attempts. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch yanked the handle of the engine room telegraph to stop and parked in order to steer left. Murdoch also ordered full speed astern to try to slip around the ice. Then he pushed a button to close doors in the watertight bulkheads. For more than 30 seconds, deck crew and lookouts held their breath. At the last moment, the Titanic's bow sprung to port and the mountain of ice slid along the starboard side. Fleet figured the ship had escaped. But there's more to an iceberg than meets the eye. 9/10 lies hidden. The berg's underwater bulk punched the starboard hull plates. Passenger Ella White, just getting ready for sleep, likened the din to rolling over 1,000 marbles. The sound faded at the stern, passing unnoticed by many, but in the bow, passengers knew they had bumped an iceberg because chunks fell in the well deck. Below, in the forward boilers and mailrooms, the crew worried. Water gushed into the first 5 compartments. Captain Smith summoned ship designer Thomas Andrews to survey the damage. Andrews found water flooding the forward compartments from the forepeak to boiler number 6. The Titanic's fate was clear. The watertight bulkheads would do no good. They rose only as high as E-deck, above the surface in a sound ship, but useless if the ship's bow began to sink and seawater lapped the bulkheads' top edges. Andrews figured the weight of seawater entering the first 5 compartments would pull the ship deep enough to let water spill into the 6th. The added weight in the 6th would pull even deeper, causing spillover into the 7th. Inevitably, each compartment would fill and flood the next. The Titanic had 2 hours or so to live. Smith gave orders to send a radio call for help, fire distress rockets, and full lifeboats. An emergency without a plan. A cruel snag of bureaucracy became evident. According to out-of-date yet still standard Board of Trade regulations, all ships exceeding 10,000 tons had to have at least 16 lifeboats plus additional rafts and floats. Those numbers worked fine for old-style passenger liners in 1896, the year of their adoption, but proved shamefully inadequate as shipbuilders produced behemoths such as the Titanic, which registered more than 46,000 tons. The Board of Trade also believed that stronger ships of recent construction likely could not sink, rendering the issue of lifeboat capacity moot. I should also note that the reason that they had few lifeboats besides that was that so many ships were out in the ocean that they thought that if there was an emergency, they would fill up lifeboats, go to a ship, reload, lower them, come back, fill them up again, and get everyone off. But as we're about to find out, there weren't any ships around to do that. The Titanic's board-approved lifeboat spread among 16 wooden craft and 4 canvas-sided Engleharts could seat only half aboard. At least 1,050 must die. The The ship's officers knew how many the lifeboats could seat, but they did not fill them to capacity for two reasons. First, Second Officer Charles Lightoller testified the crew doubted that the lowering mechanism could bear the weight of the full 70 passengers per boat. Second, crew members knew they could not waste time before launching. To do so would risk the ship sinking before all lifeboats and Englehearts could be lowered to the sea. Time ran out on the final two boats. One dropped into the sea before the crew could complete the launch, and the waves swept another overboard upside down. And there was one that, fell on someone and crushed them. Ugh. Anyway, all told, lifeboats left the Titanic with more than 400 empty seats. Relatively few occupants were men. When Smith ordered lifeboats filled, he hoisted a megaphone and barked, "Women and children first." On the port side, Lightoller filled the boats with women and children only, except for one passenger with sailing experience. In contrast, First Officer Murdoch on the starboard side interpreted the order differently. He boarded as many women and children as were available, then gave remaining seats to men. The Titanic's stern rose out of the water as the bow plunged. Passengers in lifeboats watched in horror as those still aboard scrambled up the sloping aft deck to gain a few final seconds before sliding or jumping into the ocean. At 2:20 a.m., the Titanic disappeared. All who had failed to find a lifeboat seat went into the frigid water. A life jacket did virtually no good. Smith, Murdoch, Andrews, Phillips, and hundreds of others, ranging from millionaires to dirt-poor immigrants, drowned or froze. Miles away, the Cunard liner Carpathia received the Titanic's distress calls and got underway, straight into the ice field surrounding the stricken ship's final radioed position. Normally, the Carpathia topped out at 14.5 knots, but Captain Arthur Rostron rerouted every ounce of energy to the engines. At 17.5 knots, the Carpathia zipped forward as extra lookouts scanned nervously for bergs. Rostron ordered rockets to be fired every 15 minutes to give hope to survivors, told his medical staff to set up 3 makeshift hospitals, had chefs prepare hot soup and drinks, and readied the ship for traumatized passengers. Rostron then did one last thing. He stood on the bridge, closed his eyes, and prayed. Very famous photo. And let's look at what actually happened. You can see how it broke and drifted down to its final resting place, like this. And how this half sank and this half corkscrewed down. So it's a little harder to find. But anyway, it's a little depressing to read about that part. But we're going to leave it there for tonight. If you do want me to read the rest about how it was found, it is interesting, but most of it is from the first-person perspective of the guy that found it, which, I mean, is cool. We love Robert Ballard, but I don't know. I just didn't think it was very well written, to be honest. But yeah, maybe another day if you really, really want me to. Anyway, that's it for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope you have a very good night. Good night.